When traders moved across regions, they craved home cuisine, and the first restaurants emerged to cater to this demand. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we are talking about a brief modern history of food along with the advent of restaurants. The very first establishments that were easily recognizable as restaurants popped up around 1100 AD in China, when cities like Kaifeng and Hangzhou boasted of densely packed urban populations of more than 1 million inhabitants each. Trade was bustling between these northern and southern capitals of the 12th century Song dynasty. But the Chinese tradesmen who were traveling outside their home city weren't accustomed to the local foods yet. So the original restaurants in these two cities essentially ended up being southern cooking for people coming from the south, or northern cooking for people coming down from the north. So you could say the first restaurants essentially were ethnic restaurants. And these restaurants were located in lively entertainment districts. And these districts catered to business travelers, and they were complete with hotels, bars, and brothels. According to Chinese documents from this era, the variety of restaurant options in the 1120s resembled a downtown tourist district in a 21st century city. In Japan, a distinct restaurant culture arose out of the Japanese tea house traditions of the 1500s that predated today's seasonal and local movements by half a millennium. The 16th century Japanese chef Sheno Ryukyu created the multi-course kaiseki dining tradition. In this, the entire tasting menus were crafted to tell the story of a particular place and season. Ryukyu's grandson expanded the tradition to include specialty serving dishes and cutlery that matched the aesthetic of the food being served. Now, despite centuries of trade between the East and the West, there is no evidence that the early restaurant cultures of China or Japan influenced later European notions of the restaurant. However, around the same time that Japanese chefs were creating full sensory dining experiences, a separate tradition took hold in the West, known in France as the table d'hôte, meaning table host. That was a fixed price meal eaten at a communal table. This wasn't a restaurant per se, because only one meal was served each day precisely at 1 p.m. And if you weren't paid up and sitting at the table, you wouldn't get to eat. And there was no menu and no choice, and the cook at the hotel or inn decided what was prepared and served, not the guests. Legend says that the first French restaurants popped up in Paris after the French Revolution, when the gourmet chefs of the guillotined aristocracy went looking for work. However, recent research has depicted a different story. The word restaurant comes from the French verb restaurer, meaning to restore oneself. And the first true French restaurants opened decades before the 1789 revolution. These were supposedly the health food shops, selling one principal dish, the bouillon. The French description of this type of slow-simmered bone broth is a bouillon restaurant or restorative broth. The bouillon restaurateurs sat their customers at a small cafe-sized table. They had a printed menu from which people ordered dishes, as opposed to the tavern keeper saying, "This is what's for lunch today." And they were more flexible in their meal hours. Everybody didn't have to get there at 1 p.m. and eat whatever was on the table. Once the bouillon restaurants caught on, it didn't take long for other items to show up on the menu. A little wine, some stewed chicken, and by the late 1780s, the health-conscious bouillon shops had evolved into the first grand Parisian restaurants, like Trois Feuillets and La Grande Taverne de Londres, and these would serve as the archetype of fine restaurant dining for the next century. And as evident from the history in both China and France, you can't have restaurants without a large and hungry urban population. So, keeping with the trend, the first fine dining restaurant in America was opened in New York City in the 19th century. Delmonico's opened its doors in 1837, featuring luxurious private dining suites and a 1,000 bottle wine cellar. The restaurant, which remains at the same Manhattan location, although it closed its doors during the 2020 COVID-19 lockdowns, claims to be the first in America to use tablecloths, and its star chefs not only invented the famous Delmonico steak, but also gourmet classics like Eggs Benedict, Baked Alaska, Lobster Newburg, and Chicken a la Keene. Let us now look at some of the popular foods across the globe and trace their historical origins. In 1802, the Oxford English Dictionary described a Hamburg steak as a hard slab of salted minced beef, often slightly smoked, mixed with onions and breadcrumbs. Now jump ahead to 1848, when political revolution shook the 39 states of the German Confederation that led to an increase in German immigration to the United States. With the German people came German food. Beer gardens flourished in American cities, while butchers offered panoply of traditional meat preparations. Because Hamburg was known as an exporter of high-quality beef, restaurants began offering a Hamburg-style chopped steak. In mid-19th century America, preparations of raw beef that had been chopped, chipped, ground, or scraped were a common prescription for digestive issues. A New York doctor, James H. Salisbury, suggested in 1867 that cooked beef patties might be just as healthy, and that led to cooks and physicians alike quickly adopting the Salisbury steak. Around the same time, the first popular meat grinders for home use became widely available, and Salisbury himself endorsed one called the American Chopper, setting the stage for an explosion of readily available ground beef. The hamburger seems to have made its jump from plate to bun in the last decade of the 19th century, but the channel for this transformation is very contested. Lunch wagons, fair stands, roadside restaurants in Wisconsin, Ohio, New York, and Texas have all been put forward as possible sites for the hamburger's birth. But the burger on the bun found its first wide audience in the 1904 St. Louis World Fair, which also introduced millions of Americans to new foods ranging from the waffle ice cream cones and cotton candy to peanut butter and iced tea. 2 years later, though, the hamburger almost met an untimely end when Upton Sinclair's journalistic novel, The Jungle, detailed the unsavory side of the American meatpacking industry. Industrial ground beef was easy to adulterate with fillers, preservatives, and meat scraps, and the hamburger became a primary suspect. But then two visionaries appeared on the scene. Edgar Billy Ingram and Walter Anderson opened their first White Castle restaurant in Kansas in 1921. Securing inside and out in gleaming porcelain and stainless steel, White Castle countered hamburger meat's low reputation by becoming a bastion of cleanliness, health, and hygiene. In fact, they even commissioned a medical school study to show the health benefits of hamburgers. Their system, which included on-premise meat grinding, worked very well and was the inspiration for other national hamburger chains founded in the boom years after World War II. McDonald's and In-N-Out Burger were founded in 1948, Burger King in 1954, and Wendy's in 1969. The roots of ramen can be traced back to China, whose noodle-eating food culture was introduced in Japan during the 1860s when Japan ended its national isolation and reopened its ports to the outside world. The Chinese method of making and cooking noodles eventually evolved into a unique Japanese style that became known as ramen. In the late 19th century, many Chinese settled in the port of Yokohama in Japan as shopkeepers, laborers, housekeepers, and chefs for Western traders who were pretty active in the city. Eventually, those Chinese immigrants established their own Nankin Machi. Nanking being the Japanese pronunciation of Nanjing, and Nankin Machi later evolved into Yokohama's own unique Chinatown. In Nankin Machi, restaurants and food stalls popped up to cater to the needs of workers and shopkeepers, and by 1887, there were about 20 Chinese restaurants in Yokohama which were serving noodle dishes, including Chashao Tangmia soup noodle with sliced pork and Raozi Tangmia soup noodles with thin pork strips. Not just Chinese, but Japanese locals also patronized these shops, where the Japanese referred to the noodle dishes as Nankin soba. In 1910, a retired Japanese customs official who had been working in Yokohama opened his own Chinese restaurants in Asakusa area of Tokyo. He hired Chinese cooks from Nankin Machi, changed the name of the noodle dishes from Nankin soba to Shina soba. He added toppings of chashao, or as it eventually became to be known as Japanese chashu, a type of cooked pork, and menma, simmered strips of sweet bamboo shoots. Some years later, when the city of Tokyo was reduced to rubble in the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, portable stalls served Shina soba, and the popularity of the dish multiplied. In the northern island of Hokkaido, the Chinese restaurant Takeya opened in the city of Sapporo in 1921, across the street from a university. A Chinese chef at the restaurant concocted a delicious version of Raozi Tangmian that was authentically Chinese and much sought after by the Chinese exchange students at the university. When the dish was ready, the cook would announce "Hao lei," that is, a delicious dish is complete. The lei sounded like ra to the Japanese ear, and it was from this phrase that ra was paired with the Japanese word man, meaning noodles. So Takeya's ramen noodles became tremendously popular, setting in motion a fad that swept through the entire city of Sapporo. Momofuku Ando, in 1958, invented the world's first instant, pre-cooked and dried ramen noodles that were sold in a packet, and that spawned what would eventually become a global industry. At a time when television was just beginning to catch on in Japan, he aired instant noodle commercials constantly, familiarizing Japanese throughout the country with the product. And in 1966, Ando traveled to the US to pitch his instant noodles in supermarkets. Local supermarket staff removed the ramen noodles from the package, broke them in half, and placed them in a paper cup, poured in hot water, and then ate them with a fork. At that time, very few Americans owned noodle bowls or used chopsticks. And it was this episode that inspired Ando to develop new cup-type instant noodles. Today, some 100 billion servings of instant noodles are consumed annually around the world. And now, let's talk about the most popular food across the globe, the pizza. The modern birthplace of pizza is southwestern Italy's Campania region, which is home to the city of Naples. Naples in the 1700s and early 1800s was a thriving waterfront city. Technically an independent kingdom, it was notorious for its throngs of working poor or lazzaroni. These Neapolitans required inexpensive food that could be consumed quickly. Pizza, which is flatbreads with various toppings, eaten for any meal and sold by the street vendors or informal restaurants, met this need. The experts and the Italian authors often call this eating habit disgusting. These early pizzas consumed by the Naples' poor featured the tasty garnishes that are loved even today, such as tomatoes, cheese, oil, anchovies, and garlic. Now, Italy unified in 1861, and King Umberto I and Queen Margherita visited Naples in 1889. Legend has it that the traveling pair became bored with their steady diet of French hot cuisine and asked for an assortment of pizzas from the city's Pizzeria Brandi, the successor to the Da Pietro Pizzeria, founded in 1760. The variety that the Queen enjoyed the most was called pizza mozzarella, which was a pie topped with the soft white cheese, red tomatoes, and green basil. Basically, the colors of the Italian flag. But then on, the particular topping combination was dubbed Pizza Margherita. It is possible that Queen Margherita's love for this pizza could have started a Italy-wide pizza craze, but pizza remained little known in Italy beyond Naples' borders all the way until the 1940s. An ocean away, across the Atlantic, immigrants to the United States from Naples were replicating their trusty, crusty pizza in New York and other American cities, including Trenton, New Haven, Boston, Chicago, etc. The Neapolitans were coming for factory jobs, as did millions of Europeans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And they weren't seeking to make a culinary statement, but relatively quickly, the flavors and aromas of pizzas began to intrigue the non-Italians. One of the first documented United States pizzerias was G. Lombardi's on Spring Street in Manhattan, licensed to sell pizza in 1905. Lombardi's still is in operation today, though no longer at its 1905 location. But they have the same oven as they did originally. As Italian Americans and their food migrated from city to suburb, east to west, especially after World War II, pizza's popularity in the United States boomed. It was no longer seen as an ethnic treat, and it became increasingly identified as a fast, fun food. Regional, decidedly non-Neapolitan variations emerged eventually, including California gourmet pizzas topped with anything from barbecue chicken to smoked salmon. Interestingly, post-war pizza finally reached Italy and beyond, and the rest of the world, including Italians, picked up on pizza just because it was American. Today, international outposts of American chains like Domino's and Pizza Hut thrive in about 60 different countries, reflecting local tastes and global pizza toppings, which vary from the paneer topping in India to hard-boiled eggs in Brazil. And it is here that we conclude this fun journey with food. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which country has the biggest share of the credit outstanding from IMF? The IMF has a total of $102.8 billion credit outstanding, of which by far the most has been extended to Argentina with $43.9 billion. So the answer is C, Argentina. Question for this week's episode. What city is considered the food capital of the world? By food capital, we mean the place where a majority of the population eats outside, meaning in restaurants, food stalls, etc., rather than eating at home. Is it A, Hong Kong, B, Barcelona, Spain, C, New York City, New York, or D, London, England? Once again, what city is considered the food capital of the world? A, Hong Kong, B, Barcelona, Spain, C, New York City, New York, or D, London, England? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in this episode. For the next episode, we'll take a holidays break, and the next episode will air on the 8th of January 2022. In that episode and the next, we will cover two regions of controversy post India's partition: Kashmir and Balochistan. Till then, have a wonderful holiday season and a very happy new year. And we will talk soon here with the Why in History.